Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Demmert, and I am the Law and Policy Consultant with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And I will be facilitating today's webinar entitled FVPSA 101, Grant Opportunities. Thank you to my co-presenter, Tammy Truitt-Giroux, and for all of you for joining us for today's webinar. Today's webinar is recorded and will be available for download on the Resource Center's website along with the PowerPoint. The Resource Center is dedicated to strengthening local tribal government responses through community organizing efforts, advocating for the safety of women and children in their communities and homes, especially against domestic and sexual violence and abuse. In that capacity, through our efforts and in partnerships with tribal governments, other organizations, and allies, we provide leadership in Alaska and across the nation about important issues, laws impacting our communities, and providing education about these issues. Today's webinar is an overview of the Family Violence Prevention Act, which has an open solicitation for a grant right now. We will provide an overview of what the Family Violence Prevention Act is, or otherwise known as FVPSA. Then we'll talk about the open solicitation with the due date, as well as discuss the application process. I would note, I'm going to turn this over to our technical advisor, Candy Hyun, right now, and then Tammy and I will be joining you back.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining our webinar today. There are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. On the right side of the screen, you'll see the GoToWebinar control panel. Within the control panel, there are 3 sections that I'd like to bring your attention to. The first is the questions section. Use this section to ask any questions you may have during the webinar. All questions typed into this box will come back to us, and we'll provide these to the presenters at the appropriate time. We will attempt to answer all questions asked, either during a question and answer portion of the webinar or via email. The second section I'd like to highlight is the audio section. If you are experiencing bad audio at any time during the webinar, open this section and select the phone option for several seconds, then click back to the computer audio. This will force the control panel to obtain a new audio connection for you. If you're still having issues, keep it selected on phone and dial the number shown to connect to audio portion of the webinar over your telephone. And then the third section I'd like to highlight is the handout section. In this section, you'll find the slides being shown as an available download in PDF. Any other resources mentioned will also be listed there. Clicking to download files from this section should not interrupt the webinar connection. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will share it on our website and social media feeds later today or tomorrow, as already mentioned. If you haven't yet, be sure to sign up for our mailing list and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Candy. I am going to turn it over to Tammy now, if you could, please. Next slide.
Hi, this is Tammy Truitt-Giroux, and I am the Executive Director of the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And I'm going to just briefly tell you a little bit about the organization. As Michelle pointed out, is that our main goal is to help tribes really build capacity within our tribal communities to deal with these really hard issues that we have to deal with in terms of domestic violence and sexual violence and the other things that are impacting our communities in such a negative way. The Resource Center was funded through FVPSA ourselves as a special resource center, state-based special Indigenous resource center. In 2017 appropriations, and our medical assistance and training, including needs assessments. Two is the public awareness and resource development, policy development and systems advocacy and engagement, and research and knowledge development. These were the four main focuses for the Resource Center's funding, and we are accomplishing that in many, many different ways. One of the main goals of the Resource Center is we are organizing and facilitating a process of discussion and engagement. That's our main premise of how we do business as a resource center. Being Indigenous based, being many of our staff have lived, worked, and are a part of the Alaska culture. We really believe that it's important to facilitate discussions within our villages or tribal communities to provide victims pathways to safety. That's the primary goal overall always. Increased accountability of abusers. We understand that in a lot of small communities, when someone is abusing, we don't necessarily want them to go away from their home, but we want them to stop abusing. So there has to be some kind of accountability. There really does. Increase the village response to domestic violence. And sometimes that's through the tribal discussions and education and, engaging with the community and talking about what that looks like and how it could look differently. Determining changes needed within the village to increase village-wide response to domestic violence within the community. And we say this really carefully because it is not our goal to come in and tell a village or a tribal community what to do or tribal government. Our goal is to really have conversations and discussions and help the community decide what it is that community feels that they are able and comfortable and feeling like they want to do to make that change and have that and have a response that's going to be impactful. Because as you know, living in a lot of our small tribal communities, a lot of the systems that are in place really aren't effective for isolated village Alaska. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Michelle.
So, what is Fvpsa and what can it do for your community? Well, to start off, the Family Violence Prevention Services Act is under the Family Youth Services Bureau, which is an office of the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families at the Administration for Children and Families Administration. So that's a lot of words for these two programs, but I think it's really important to evaluate that their whole goal is to provide services to children and families. So this is somewhat unique when it comes to domestic violence, in that children programs can be included in some of these things that we do. The Fvpsa program is committed to helping states, territories, and tribes provide emergency shelter and supportive services to victims of domestic violence and their dependents. Well, how do they do that? They provide funding for shelters and other supportive services for victims and their children. They attempt to coordinate statewide improvements through the leadership of state domestic violence coalitions and Fvpsa state administrators. In Alaska, we have the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence Sexual Assault, ANDVSA, who is our statewide coalition. They increase public awareness about the prevalence of domestic violence, dating violence, and family violence through funding studies and research. And then they support specialized and comprehensive technical assistance through resource centers and culturally specific institutes like the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, the National Indigenous Women Resource Center, and many others. Next slide, please. How are Fvpsa funds distributed? Well, on this pie chart, you'll see that the majority of the funding goes to state and territorial formula grants, and 10% goes to tribal formula grants. 10% goes to those state domestic violence coalition grants like ANDVSA. 6% goes to national special issue resource centers. 2.5% goes to administering these programs, evaluating and monitoring. And then 1.5% goes to discretionary, which could be specialized programs according to the Secretary's priorities at the time. Next slide, please. Fvpsa funding support.
Hello.
Oh, there you go, Jenny.
Sorry, I was on mute, trying to get off mute. So Fvpsa funding supporting tribes and Alaska Natives. You know, the Family Violence and Prevention Services Act, Fvpsa, grants to Native American tribes, including Alaska Native villages and tribal organizations, are formula grants. And what that means is that, and that's through that 10% set aside in the Fvpsa appropriations. So funding is available to all Native American tribes or tribal organizations that meet the definition of the Indian tribe or tribal organization and are able to demonstrate their capacity to carry out domestic violence prevention. So part of this 10% set aside for tribes is that they have a formula funded grant. That means if you do the things that you say you're going to do in your grant, and you reapply and you do your reports, and it's a fairly straightforward reporting system, then you're going to be refunded every year, which is, it's not a great deal of money because the formula right now is based on, when tribes apply, is really based on population, and the base amount for these tribal formula grants is not large, and then it's based on the population after that. So it's important to understand that as we go through. In 2018, and the next slide will show us that in 2018, Alaska tribes received there was about 37 grantees. Now, some of those grantees were tribes that were consortiums, or what they call consortiums, or that through MOA they worked together to get the funding, and so of course that increased the funding. But there was in the appropriations this year, there was $5 million extra that was appropriated for tribal grantees. And so the Fvpsa office did the regular formula grantees, and so many small tribes received, when you're under a certain population, they received a base amount of $24,776. And then through the supplemental funding, they received $21,604. Now, the important piece of that is that it's not a great deal of money for the smaller tribes. And in Alaska, most of our tribes are really, that's a standard funding for them. But this is also around the nation. A lot of the tribes that are under a certain population base receive these small amounts of money. The beauty and the importance of this money, though, it is that it really can be impactful to victims. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how impactful that is. And so this last year, we had 37 grantees in Alaska out of the 229 tribes. But some of those grantees were multiple tribes. And so it was probably closer to 50 tribes that actually received funding. And we will come to the questions. So people that are chatting with questions will definitely answer those. We'll have a spot where we'll answer some of those. So I'll turn this back over to Michelle for a moment.
Next slide, please. So again, I think what's really important with understanding Fvpsa is that it's essentially a non-competitive grant that's based on your service area population. So if you meet the requirements the application requirements that we'll get into eventually, you will be funded for many services that can have a direct impact on your community, such as shelter. There could be putting someone up in a hotel. There could be helping someone get transportation to another community in order to get out of the village. There could be public awareness materials that you prepare, there's just a lot of benefit for these small grants that have a lot of flexibility, have minimal reporting requirements, but yet provide meaningful opportunities for you to assist your community in helping to get out of a difficult or dangerous situation into safety. Next slide, please. Just to provide, I think you want one too many. Just to provide an overview, in 2015, state grantees received 2.5 million crisis calls, and they were able to respond to those. So other than 130,000 adult victims and 111,000 children, that's pretty significant when you think about just the overall population within some of the communities. And then the other part is that you can provide some crisis services such as counseling, support groups, advocacy. We'll get into some more specifics, such as if necessary, you might be able to help with getting legal services to get protection orders or something, or maybe a custody in order to help someone protect their children from a domestic violence situation. There's a lot of flexibility in how the money can be spent. Next slide, please.
Okay, and I guess, so basically with the services that are provided under Fvpsa funded tribal programs, and there's a couple of questions in here that I don't want to ignore, but that we will come back to because they're important questions. But the services provided by the Fvpsa funded tribal programs is that 135 million was appropriated to Fvpsa in 2015. 13.5 million in Fvpsa formula grants were distributed based on population to 260 different tribes in 28 states. So what that means is that the law, Fvpsa, appropriates a certain, they have an appropriations amount that they are funded, that they can be funded up to. But they don't necessarily always they've never been funded to the full amount in the government. They've never appropriated the full amount. And so this amount, this 135,000 was the standard. And in the last couple of years, it's been interesting. It has gone up some, which helped with what we talked about with the supplemental funding. Again, not knowing if we will get the supplemental funding in the 2019 appropriations. And so it's important, though, that this funding is that even if for instance, if it was funded at the maximum amount allowed, 10% of that's going to be distributed for the tribes. That's just a standard. They have to distribute by the percentages that they've laid out. So the next slide talks a little bit about where the majority of a lot of the funding has gone, and to the tribes that have gone. Now, for instance, Navajo Nation is a good example of this. Navajo Nation has thousands of enrolled members. So they, could we move to the next slide, please? So they receive quite a lot. No, go back one, thanks. So they receive quite a lot of funding based on the formula. But that in Alaska, we have, it says 10 to 17 tribes were funded in, next slide, please. There we go. One more. There we go. So in Alaska in 2015, there was 10 to 17 tribes that were funded. And that was in California, they had 50 some odd tribes. And California and Alaska, amazingly enough, have some similarities because they do have several small tribes, and they're also PL2 80 states, which we're not going to go into at this point. But and in Nevada, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Washington, they had 10 to 17 tribes. I think I gave you the wrong numbers, but between Alaska and California, they had over 50 tribes. And down in I'm looking at our little chart here, and down, if you look at the lower right, Arizona, Louisiana, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Montana, Nebraska, South Dakota, Wisconsin, they funded about between 3 and 9 tribes. I think that one of the things that happens, though, is that again, it's based on formula, and so the amounts that are funded are going to vary quite a lot. And then only 1 to 2 tribes in these other states that are listed up here in the upper right-hand box. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to turn it over. Keep the next slide, please. And I apologize. Sometimes there's a delay on the slides, and it's faster for me, and it's not for other people. So I appreciate your patience. It depends on where we are with the internet. As you can see here on this picture, in Alaska in 2018, we had 37 plus tribes funded. That's actually a large amount for Alaska, and we're not going to name each tribe or tribal consortium that's funded, but we're going to see in the next couple of slides some of the tribes that were funded. If you notice, there's a big cluster of tribes that have been consistently funded in the interior. And a lot of those small interior tribes have been funded since the late 90s. One of the reasons for that is that through Tanana Chiefs, they had a social services director who was who knew about the funding, was, I think, fairly creative in how he was able to help tribes utilize funding. And so all these small tribes in the interior have consistently applied for funding over the years. And I think one of the beauties of that, I worked as both a social worker and a tribal administrator for many years for a small interior tribe. And this Fvpsa funding was amazing funding. And why I say that is because there were a lot of times when someone who had been victimized needed to try to get to a safe place, and there was just no safe place in that particular community. And so they wanted to go to a relative's in a community 40 miles away, but there was no way, they couldn't pay for it. It's expensive, and you have 4 or 5 children, and it's expensive. But with these kinds of funds, the tribe approved that kind of travel for safety. And so they would buy a ticket. There was a lot of confidentiality involved. There were a lot of other things that were involved in making the decision. But the money was able to help really fill a need that wasn't there. A lot of programs, when you have to come in from rural Alaska to a shelter, say in Anchorage or Bethel or Barrow or wherever you might be located, a lot of those programs don't have funds to travel, mostly women and children who would need to seek safety outside of their community. And so I find that these funds have been really beneficial for that. And it's one of the reasons that I truly encourage tribes to apply for these funds if they're working with victims at all. So in the next 2 slides, we just listed the villages and tribal organizations that were funded under the Fvpsa formula this year. And again, you can see there's it's a lot of pretty small communities. You have a couple of them that were funded, Tlingit and Haida, which is a larger tribal entity. You also have the Manilik Association, which I know that these funds help with some of their shelter that they have up there. You have the Ammonic Women's Shelter. Again, several of the tribes in their area came together through MOUs to help fund the shelter there in Ammonic. So there's a lot of creative things that happen utilizing these funds for safety. So I'm going to turn this over to Michelle.
Next slide, please. So what other tribal programs are funded by Fvpsa? Next slide. One of the programs that was recently funded beginning in 2017, which was the year we were funded, is the Strong Hearts Native Helpline. And what this is, next slide please, is part of the National Hotline, which is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. So anyone could call it 24 hours a day to seek support or services. And we found that our Native women were not utilizing that hotline in ways that the other population was using it. So we advocated for a Native-specific hotline, and were funded for a short period of time through the National Hotline funding. And what is being served there is any American Indian or Alaska Native affected by domestic violence can call in to see if there's any referrals for culturally appropriate services, ask for information education, get immediate support. So just someone there who can listen and provide some ideas for safety. But the one thing is that the hours are limited at this point. They're limited from 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. And if you call during any other time, it will go to the national hotline where you can either, well, actually you'll be given an option to either roll over to the national hotline or to leave a name and number for a callback. And this organization has provided a lot of resources, and they're seeking permanent funding that might make them 24 hours a day, so that women in our communities who are in such situations can feel that they have someone on the other side of the telephone who can listen to them. Next slide, please. And so the Alaska Native Tribal Resource Center is also funded by Fvpsa, and we are funded through the 2017 appropriation. We've been approved for a 3-year grant. And so that, but we're also seeking permanent funding to provide consistent services within our Alaska communities, so that you'll have a one-stop shop to address the issues that you need technical assistance with. So, are there questions so far? Next slide, please.
Actually, Michelle, there are a couple of questions that I am seeing that we might want to go ahead and answer. There was, and I'm going to go ahead and just read the question, the first one, and this one was sent through the email, and the first question is, can funds be used to train advocates, counselors, local healers, and helpers who could run talking circles? And my first answer is yes, absolutely. And then the longer answer is this, is that the also unique thing about Fvpsa funds is that there are prevention pieces as part of Fvpsa, but also training advocates to respond is a very key piece to helping our communities be safer and have an appropriate response. And I believe that any kind of cultural aspect to that is definitely supported for tribes. So that's the quick and the longer answer to that. And so I just wanted to make sure that that was answered. And there's a couple more, but we can try to answer those as we go through the, I think there was another one that I would like to address. I think one was addressed, and that was, okay. I think there was another one where a community, their grant didn't make it in for some reason into Fvpsa. And you know, we've had this issue over the years as well, and especially with the computers and internet issues. And at the end, I believe we have some contacts for you, but if we contact the Fvpsa office, they've been really good about allowing us to either, if we let them know in advance, mail in the application, um, to email it directly to a program specialist at Fvpsa, or a support staff there at Fvpsa, and instead of trying to make sure, you know, in case it doesn't get through their system somehow. So I'm going to go ahead and we can go ahead and move on, and we'll keep answering questions as we go.
Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to move into part 2 of the training, which goes into the application process. As Tammy just mentioned, there are requirements that need to be met, and unfortunately, we run into situations in Alaska where we just can't seem to upload the application processes or requirements in the time frame that's required. So please, if you do run into that, let us know and we'll help you. Next slide. What we have seen, last year, Fvpsa laid out a 3-year solicitation. And so for the 3 years, the same solicitation applies, and that's in one of the handouts that is listed there that Candy referenced earlier in the presentation. And the 2 due dates that are important from this point on are February 28, 2019 and February 28, 2020. Those are the must-have-in deadlines for those 2-year applications. Next slide, please. The Fvpsa announcement that was provided just lays out, again, what it's required to do and what you would be empowered to do for your community. So the purpose of the grants is to assist tribes in efforts to increase public awareness about and primary and secondary prevention of family violence, domestic violence, and dating violence. So that's pretty broad, and that could be, prevention, could be brochures, it could be training. There's a lot of things that could be done within that broad frame of purpose. The second is to assist tribes in efforts to provide immediate shelter and supportive services for victims of family violence, domestic violence, dating violence, and their dependents. So again, that could be emergency shelter, that could be paying for a hotel, it could be paying for airfare to get out of the community to a safe place. Maybe the woman and her children left the home without anything at all, and so they need diapers or some temporary or a few clothing items. Maybe they need some groceries to get through for a few weeks until they can get more permanent living situations. I mean, it's pretty flexible as to what could be included in the shelter and supportive services. But again, other traditional, conventional type services could be counseling. It could be providing, assistance with accessing services that may not be available in the community, may not be funded by the tribe, may be funded through private, sort of services, and you would be able to help her access those services as well. Next slide, please. Tammy?
Hi, this is Tammy. Sorry about that. I keep trying to get off mute. The one thing, as Michelle pointed out, is that there's some flexibility. The main goal of Fvpsa dollars is shelter, supportive services, safety, and some prevention. And so, one of the in this funding opportunity announcement, it's designed to assist tribes in their efforts. So to support the establishment, maintenance, and expansion of programs and projects. And in order to how they see that happening is prevent incidents of family violence, domestic violence, and dating violence. Ultimately, of course, that's what we want to see happen. Provide immediate shelter, supportive services, and access to community-based programs for victims of family violence, domestic violence, or dating violence and their dependents. And to provide specialized services for children exposed to family violence, domestic violence, or dating violence, underserved populations, and victims who are members of underserved populations. Now, one of the things about that is that Fvpsa is really one of the only grants over the years until recently that acknowledged the impact that domestic violence has on children, witnessing that. And so that was always a key piece in terms of doing any kind of like prevention activities or using this funds to be able to house a family away from domestic violence. I know that, for instance, a tribe that I've worked with here in the past, they did a rental assistance for a family who had to leave the community because there was no housing in the community. And so they had to move to a larger community, and they had, mom was the main breadwinner, but mom had to leave her job. And so she really didn't have a lot of resources to house her children. And so the tribe at that point was willing and able to help her temporarily until she was able to establish herself in the other community to get on her feet. One of the things we hear a lot is that and we see a lot, all of us have worked in this field for any length of time, is that when someone's in a situation where they're being battered, they want it to stop. That's the ultimate goal. They want it to stop, and so they want to get out of the situation right away with their children to get to safety. But oftentimes when things have calmed down and that people go back and they go back together because it's hard to leave your home. It's hard to leave your life, and you don't want the violence, and people don't want the violence, and so I think that this particular grant is helpful for that. I know that there's been some tribes who have actually written in their narrative that if, for instance, you have a family that left and went to a shelter in another community, in a hub community or something, and they were able to get there and they stayed there for a while until things were sorted out and settled down. And then they didn't have money to go home, but they wanted to go home. And again, as a program and as advocates, we don't judge that. We don't judge, what people, if they decide to come or go. It's not our job to judge that. But this tribe was able to help with funding for airlines to get this family back to their home. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the differences that this funding can provide when we're dealing with families. I mean, we're dealing with people that it's not just about the violence. And so life happens, and sometimes there's not the resources to help life to go on. And so when I hear that whole idea of shelter and supportive services, that's how I think of that. There are requirements, as with any money that we are going to receive from federal government or whoever the grantee might look like. The tribal grantees do have a really critical role, though, in promoting the Fvpsa priorities. And the main thing is, and I think it goes back to the question I answered earlier, is that we have trauma-informed practices and interventions. And if that's a more of a cultural healing type of activity that's going to work in that community, then that's what we need to try to be supportive of. And I think these funds can support that. In particular, services must be provided on a voluntary basis. As you know, is we can't force somebody to get help or to get services or to seek safety. That we can't force someone. Sometimes it's taken out of their hands if there happens to be law enforcement that can intervene. That's not always the case. But services must be provided on a voluntary basis, and no conditions may be applied for the receipt of emergency shelter. And this is a definite conundrum, and I don't know if that's even a word, but it's an issue that we've heard a lot in a lot of small tribal communities. Well, when you spend money, and there has to be approval from the tribe to spend that money, such as what's that, rental assistance or airplane tickets or whatever that might look like, it can get a little bit complicated on how you get approval without revealing somebody's confidentiality. And so there's some things that tribes and programs have to work out, but it is very workable. You can do it. Grantees cannot impose conditions for admission to shelter by applying for inappropriate screening methods. And what they mean by that is that they're really trying to go back to protecting victims. Is that you can't require a victim, for a good example, say you have a church that is providing emergency shelter for victims and their families. The church cannot have a screening or intake form that says, do you go to our church? That can't be a requirement to restrict someone from going to safety. And that's just a really simple example. Tribes and tribal organizations are strongly encouraged to leverage the expertise of Fvpsa-funded resource centers that comprise domestic violence networks. And so, as you know, there's 13 specialized resource centers in the country that are funded through Fvpsa. And we have 2 Indigenous resource centers. Fortunately, you have one in Alaska. That's the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. You also have a national organization, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. So those are the only 2 Indigenous funded resource centers under Fvpsa. And there's others that are quite helpful, like what Michelle had explained earlier. There's the National Hotline, which is now funding, supporting the Native hotline. So there's some other things that are very helpful and that would give technical assistance to tribes that are seeking technical assistance. Fvpsa-funded programs must establish and implement policies and protocols for maintaining the confidentiality records pertaining to any individual. Now, again, this is one of those things, and it's something you need to state in your proposals. This is one of the things that sometimes can be challenging. And I always use this example. I again was working in a very small community, living in a very small community, and all of the main buildings are on the main road. So I know that if I don't know why I would be out at 1 o'clock in the morning, but if I happen to be out at 1 o'clock in the morning and I see somebody's four-wheeler in front of the health clinic, well, I probably know why they're there. But then the next day, somebody walks into the tribal offices and says, did you know that so-and-so was at the health clinic and she probably got beat up again? I'm not going to, if that person sought help through us, I'm not going to confirm that one way or the other. I'm not even going to engage in that observation. And I understand that confidentiality in small communities is a really, really difficult task many times. But there are ways to handle that, and it's important through this funding that victims get confidentiality. If that's confidentiality in the conversation they made that call in the middle of the night, whether it's confidentiality in the fact that you have to get two people to approve funding to pay for an airline ticket, well, you need to have a system in place that's going to allow them to have some anonymity, even though they may be up at the airfield getting on the plane and everybody knows why, how, and who. But again, it's not a confirmation coming from the tribe. So I don't want to belinger that point, but that is a requirement for this funding. And so that even goes into the whole idea of best practices. And so one of the other areas that I think, and we hear this and live it day to day, is that oftentimes we don't have the resources in our small tribal communities that they do in larger communities, such as immediate shelter, such as law enforcement response, such as a healthcare response, such as, on and on and on. They're just, it's very inequitable. I mean, we understand that the disparities are large, and we understand that, small amounts of money aren't going to necessarily change that disparity. But if we try to put best practice into what we're doing, even with these small amounts of money, which are really, I think they're life-saving money myself. That's how I look at this grant. I've been working with this grant for well over 20 some odd years, and I've always felt that it was between safety and no safety, that this small amazing a pot of money has been so helpful and done amazing things. And I'm not trying to sell it to anybody. I just think it has a great deal of value. But coordination and collaboration among victim service providers that are community-based, culturally specific, sometimes faith-based, if that's what the community is using in terms of that support and that strength in their community, housing, homeless service providers, tribal, federal, state, local, public officials. Agencies are needed to provide more responsive and effective services to victims of family violence, domestic violence, dating violence, and their families. And, at least one grantee representative should also, as part of the best practices, should plan to attend Fvpsa-sponsored grantee conferences or meetings, including like the peer-to-peer mentoring, because it's important to be able to, a lot of times these funds don't necessarily fund staff, or they only fund part-time staff, or they only fund, a few hours of staff response to a crisis. But it's really important to hear what other programs are doing, because it might help the program either be able to encumber more funds with another grant program, or try to work with a program that's already existing in your community and help to kind of maximize the funds to do this good work. Okay, you may be getting tired of hearing from me, but I'm gonna keep moving on here, and then we are going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of the grant. We'll have some time to do that. The main use of funds is shelter, and when we talk about shelter, immediate shelter and related supportive services for adult and youth victims of family violence, domestic violence, or dating violence, and their dependents, including paying for operating and administrative expenses of the facilities for shelter. So when I talked a little bit earlier about how some tribes, for instance, in the lower Yukon area, combine their funds to help the Amonic Women's Shelter stay open and maintain their shelter, that's shelter and supportive services, very plain and simply. Other grantees have used to support safe houses, and whether that's just with extra food or by trying to, put some fuel in the tank of the house that is, supplying shelter, emergency shelter in their community, when they have people that are being housed with them, whether it's supplying diapers and groceries. Sometimes it's just really basic needs that have to be met, and whether that's traveling miles away in another community. So these are the kinds of things that would help support shelter. Like I talked about, I've worked with a few tribes that have been able to do some rental assistance because there was not housing in the community itself, but then other tribes where there is housing in the community have even helped a person that's been victimized pay rent in a house in the community itself outside of her family home. And so the other idea of supportive services is community-based counseling. As I think we answered earlier, part of that question, developing safety plans, helping somebody come up with a plan of escape if they need one, or having their important papers in a, I know one lady she'd wear one of those, what do you call them? A fanny pack. And she kept her 3 children's birth certificates, tribal enrollments. I think she had $20 emergency fund. That's all she had, but she kept it in there. And she kept, there was her ID and documentation. And she always carried that with her. I don't know, so that she always had it in case she needed it. Increasing the awareness of DV, doing some education pieces in the community, talking at the schools about some of the what domestic violence looks like and what kind of behaviors can happen when you experience or witness domestic violence. Culturally appropriate services. Some of our communities have awesome elder counselors. Let's help give them a stipend to help work with a family to try to, a woman and her children, just to help them through that really tough situation. Advocacy for case management, medical, legal, safe housing, childcare, transportation, and related other services. A lot of these funds don't necessarily are enough to support a staff person, but I know that in several of the interior tribes, they use part of the funds to pay for their ICWA worker is part-time DV and part-time ICWA. So it helps to supplement that salary so they do have someone. So those are the types of things that can happen with the funds, if you meet those criteria. And the criteria are fairly easy to meet, I think. So I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle.
Okay, so next slide, please. So as Tammy mentioned, there are just numerous and sort of endless examples of how tribes can use these funds, but they do have a lot of flexibility. And as Tammy mentioned, they can be life-saving in terms of what services they provide. And so, so we do find that tribes that do apply and receive these funds really do receive great benefit. Next question, or next slide, I'm sorry. So before we get into the application process, I'm told that there are a few questions. So Candy, do you want to let us know what the questions are?
Well, I think that Tammy has kind of went through some of them. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tammy. I think Elaine has a couple questions about contact information and the application process, but I don't know if you guys have that available or if that's something we should send to her later.
Okay, so hopefully after we get through the application itself, we'll have answered many of her questions, and if not, we could certainly set up time to talk with her specifically. So if you...
there is one, yeah, Michelle, there is one here that I'm trying to respond, but I'm not sure if my responses are going through on the chat box. And there was one comment about that they had helped a woman escape a situation with just the clothes on her back, and that she had started her monthly, and she really just didn't have anything. And so they're thinking about supplying keeping like a kit at their office And so, maybe some personal hygiene items and some extra clothing or, diapers. That's absolutely acceptable and actually a really good use of the funding in order to, have something on hand. You might even have a box that if you have a safe home in the community, that you have these items in the box, even small toys if you have small children to keep them occupied while you're talking and things like that. So, and they can take that with them. So those are really, really good ways of utilizing and helping, create safe space.
Great questions, great answers. So the application process is very straightforward, but there are requirements that need to be met. We have included in the handouts a template that you feel free to use. Just click on that, and I'll go through how you can use that. We also have included an MOU for 2 or more tribes that want to apply together, so that you have an agreement that sort of lays out the bare bones of what each of you, or if there's 2 or more, what you'll be doing for each other and who will have primary responsibility, as well as a cover letter that will be utilized to as part of the application process. So as you can see, you will need a DUNS number. So what is a DUNS number? So most people, most tribes have this, but this is a Dun & Bradstreet number that reveals the credit information gathered by Dun & Bradstreet. And it's a fairly straightforward application process, but it can take a little bit of time. So if your tribe has never applied for a grant and does not have a DUNS number, you should probably get on that now, and you can just Google DUNS and it should come up. And as far as other requirements, you'll have to provide a statement of need, which will go into what your service area is, the number of victims potentially to be served, and the service area, and what sort of services are available. You'll describe what the capacity is of your tribe to provide these services, who among your staff would be providing this. That's probably a general description, like a job title, not necessarily a specific person. The method that you'll be providing services, the services that you will be providing, and again, it can be very general: shelter, prevention services, counseling, holistic counseling services, things like that. A budget narrative, and this is one of the simplest budgets that you can ever put together. So you'd put together the budget based on percentages of what you would be providing, and just sort of a brief explanation about what you'd be providing. So in the example that Tammy just provided, emergency services, it could be supplies, feminine hygiene and supplies and diapers, things like that. Tammy, did you have something to weigh in there?
Yes, actually, I wanted to just mention this. At this point, I haven't seen it change in terms of the percentages. They don't necessarily, because they don't always know the amount that they're going to have appropriated, and I don't think they know that yet this year. So they've done the percentages as a way of making sure that you didn't have to try to come up with a number that they didn't know, they didn't know. And so they may start, and this is something that was in a conversation, they may start asking for budgets after the fact, but I'm not exactly sure what that process would look like. But at this point, we're still just the percentages of what your funds are going to look and go to.
So could be 50% housing, shelter, 50% counseling and prevention services, things like that. And then you would need to describe your policies and procedures, and this does not have to be elaborate. It could be very simple with the few requirements that they have around confidentiality. Your policy could be a one-pager that says each person who administers this program will sign a confidentiality agreement and receive training on that. and that would be sufficient for that. So it's not. Don't be daunted by, when you hear policies and procedures. You don't need to create anything elaborate. It can just be very straightforward and designed to meet the requirements that you're going to maintain confidences, and you're not going to require any special conditions of the people who are receiving your services. And then you'll need to have a signed current resolution. Next slide, please. The contact for our region is Sheena Williams, and her information is here. If you run into problems in the application process, you could certainly email her or call her and work through those issues. The other thing is, if there's something that we can be helpful with, we would be glad to do so. Next slide, please. The application requirements, here's a quick checklist. So you'll want to make sure that all pages are completed. You have a cover letter, the statement of need and narrative, the budget, which is basically just the percentages of what types of services will be offered, description of policies. If you're a consortium, you'd want a memorandum of agreement or understanding. We have a sample of that, a tribal resolution. The 424 is a mandatory form, which is a certification that you're not going to use money received for lobbying Congress or other entities. And then you'll have the grant application submitted through SAM, or request an exemption to mail it certified return receipt. The federal government does not like to receive hard copies of applications because of the screening requirements, and it provides a lot of layers of delay. And so that's something that they're not too fond of, and would prefer that tribes and applicants apply online. So if you click on the template 2019 copy, you'll see that what we've provided is, it's about a 12-page document, and it contains the majority of the items that are required that we just ran through. What we've done is we've highlighted in yellow instructions and things that are required, as well as a checklist. And then this form itself provides a template for all of the requirements for the application. So the project description, you'll include any required forms as well, and that will be part of the application process. The cover letter, very straightforward. It's just a Dear Sheena Williams, please see attached letter for, or please see attached application for the name of your tribe or tribal consortium. The statement of need. There is a statement of need example here included in the application. For example, it says the village to be served under this grant includes, and you put in your tribe or tribes, and insert a brief description about your tribe and what region of Alaska you're located. If you are applying on behalf of more than one tribe, if two or more, then each tribe will need to have a resolution. In the application process, you can use all of this language that's not highlighted and just insert in the brackets specifics for your community. So it goes on to say that the village to be served under this grant includes, say, Aknwrc and Barrow. I know they're not close together, but just by way of example. In the northern region of Alaska, which we have attached resolutions of both tribes. The Aknwrc tribe is located in the interior of Alaska. The tribe's mission is to, and usually each tribe has a mission as to how they serve their community, and you can often find that on the front of your home webpage. And then a brief description of what your council is. How many council members and how are they selected? Are they selected by popular vote? Maybe how often? The next section would be region covers. Insert the geographic square miles and the number of people in your community, whether they're native and non-native. There's a link to a BIA website that could be used to get that information. Then it's useful to describe how travel to and from your village is, either by air, water, both, and that I'm guessing is very expensive. So if you have any challenges with transportation, please list that, such as winter, you're restricted to only air or until the rivers freeze, then air and possibly land. So, just list what you think is important for them to understand. Then Section 2 is to provide the number of victims in domestic violence, dating violence, and their dependents that the application estimates will be served through your shelter and supportive services annually. So again, this is just a rough estimate, and could be anywhere from 10, it could be up to 100 or more. Just be honest and say, this is a new program, don't know for sure, but it's estimated at this. And then provide brief explanation of what your expected results and number to be served. So, for example, based on your population, it's recognized that you could say if you had 100 people in your village, you could say that 30% of that number could be supported by your services. That would be recognized by statistics that Fvpsa has. So you could insert that number. So then the template goes into just some general information about that reflects what the solicitation asks for, and you can just leave all of this information in if you like. And then it goes into another highlighted section, number 3. Describe the barriers that victims of domestic violence, dating violence, and their dependents are experiencing in your service area, and the challenges that the applicant is experiencing in providing services. So here is a whole list of ideas that could be true for your community. So don't just keep all of these in unless every single one of them applies to your community. But look through the list and see if any of them are applicable and keep those. Maybe you have some other specific issues that are unique to your community, and list those as well. Don't hesitate to add information to this section. Section C is capacity. So in this area, you're going to want to describe your operation or ability to operate and provide services under this program. Maybe mention any shelter that is in your community nearby, whether or not you have any safe houses, and if you have a domestic violence prevention program. It doesn't matter if, maybe you don't have any of those, then you would just say, we don't have any of these things. We don't have a shelter or safe house, and maybe that's what your goal is in getting this grant, is to establish some safe houses or to access the shelter in Bethel for your community so that you can support the folks to get out of the community to get safety. You would establish any joint or collaborative service agreements with other entities, such as, maybe they're, again, the shelter. Maybe there's a shelter elsewhere that you might be able to enter into some sort of agreement to get your community members to for safety. And then the operation of social service programs, anything that you're, if you have any social service programs that are currently being funded by Fvpsa under their child welfare services or family support grants. under Title 4B. And, you know, just ask around, and if not, then just, you know, do the best that you can. Don't get stumped by anything here. Just, you know, try your best in completing the information that's needed. I should probably check in with Candy since my chat box is not working. Do we have any questions thus far, Candy?
Well, there was a question that I think is actually a really interesting question, and I also wanted to just say a little bit about the application process itself. And that is that the question first is that if you already have an existing grant, do you have to do the same application? And the short answer is yes, you do. It may look exactly the same pretty much, except for changing the years and maybe activities, I don't know. But no, you still have to apply just as you applied for previous years. The unique situation that's happening with this grant now is that before last year, we never had a standard due date, because the grant application would come out whenever the appropriations had been made, and then they would send out the grant application, and so we never knew if we were going to apply in August or if it was going to be in September or any of those things. And so what happened with this 3-year grant process is that we now know we have due dates, which helps us, but also helps the office so that they also can get their grants out in a timely manner, and grantees can apply in a timely manner. The main thing about this grant is that it is, there are going to be grantees that do write pretty much the same thing every year, because things aren't necessarily changing that quickly. You may have 1 or 2 activities that look differently, and that's what you would explain in your narrative. And so it's just really important. And so the one other issue that has come up, and this is kind of is there's an annual reporting period, and it's due at the end of December 31st every year. So if you're a current grantee, it's really important that you get that annual report in. It's not a difficult report, but it helps you to report back to the Fvpsa office what you have been doing with your funds in terms of, have you supplied 10 shelter nights? And what they mean by shelter nights, of course, is going to be things like, did you help facilitate a victim and their families being in a safe home for 10 nights? Or did you help get someone on a plane that was able to get into a safe shelter, whether that was a family member or relative, or whether it was a formal shelter system? So did your funds help provide that? So those are kind of key and very important. The other thing that was a little bit different about this particular grant app, RFP or request for funds, is that when this RFP came out, of course, if you remember last year, we had some continuing resolutions which created a timeline that got the money out the door, the federal funds that were appropriated for different programs out the door much later than normal. And so what that meant was that even with the extra money that the tribes received in supplemental funding, whatever that was for that tribe or tribal organization, that money basically went into effect last September, or actually October 1st, 2018 until September 30th, 2019. And so it's really important that the planning that your program is doing with the current funds, that you try to make sure that those funds are spent in that time frame, whether that's prevention activities, whether that's training your advocates, whatever that might look like. And I think that there was also a question about if we're going to give you our contact information, and we definitely will at the end of this webinar. So thank you, Michelle.
Yes, absolutely. Good information. And now I'm seeing that the questions are coming through the questions, not the chat box. So I see that there are a number of questions, and we'll be sure to make sure that we are following up on those. So getting back to the application process, capacity, a description of the staff involved in carrying out the Fvpsa program. Maybe you have an Indian child welfare worker, and you can just list that position as being the one that will help with this process. Or maybe you don't have that, and so maybe it's your council secretary who understands confidentiality and can help with that. You know, there's no right answer. It's just a matter of who in your community and what is their experience, skills, and knowledge around this program to maintain the requirements of confidentiality and not having any barriers to receiving services. And then you would want to describe the methods for providing services. So you can list any programs that you might partner with. You know, just to let you know, the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center is here to help technical assistance, training, policy development, system engagement, as we mentioned. And, you know, this is something that Fvpsa funds us to do, is to help other applicants who receive grants from their program. And so we're happy to help you with any of that. And then, you know, Section D would be describing the services that you're going to be providing. And we have some information in the application that you can borrow from and expand upon, such as safe homes. You know, you can say the Aknwrc tribe will be creating safe homes within the community, who they'll be recruited to accommodate both adults and children, and will be trained to provide the services. So back to the original question, can you provide training to individuals to do peace circles or provide services? And as Tammy said, it's absolutely yes, and that can be part of your application process. It could be peer-to-peer counseling, could be assistance in developing safety plans. Maybe you're training your community staff workers on how to appropriately respond. So again, it's very flexible. And all of this, the application that we've provided lays out the information provided. Now, the budget narrative, it's a 2-year budget period, but as Tammy indicated, you apply each year. So it gets a little bit confusing, but again, you're not putting a maximum dollar amount in your application, you're putting percentages. So if you look at the budget period pages, it describes staff positions, how much will go towards funding staff positions, how much will go towards travel, training, technical assistance activities, how much will go for creating public awareness, prevention materials, and outreach. And again, that could also include, maybe you're going to work with someone in the school district to put together information, prevention materials, and outreach. And then, you know, how much will you be providing towards shelter? So that's important to provide as well. And that could be rent, utilities, maintenance, things to help the survivor obtain housing elsewhere. If you're going to be putting them up in a hotel, you know, you might want to say what the cost of that is per night in your region, just to give them a base amount. And then client support costs, such as transportation, food, clothing, supplies, things like that. That might be diapers, send them hygiene products, it could be food, and just the estimated number of individuals and nights there. There is a special section on consortium applicants, and this is only applicable if 2 or more tribes are applying together. You would need to name each tribe in the consortium, then provide the tax ID for each tribe in the consortium. Each tribe would need to have a DUNS number, that Dun and Bradstreet number that I mentioned. and you would need to confirm that each tribe is a federally recognized tribe, and each tribe would have to have a resolution. So moving through the application process, as we're running out of time here, you'll see that towards the end of the template is a resolution that your tribe could use. We also provide the assurances of compliance with grant requirements towards the end, which has to be signed by a tribally designated official. And then also in the handout material, we have a sample cover letter that you can use. We have an MOU, or it could be entitled the MOA for 2 or more tribes, and it just lays out what the tribes are and their contact information and the roles of each. And so we've tried to make this process as helpful to all of you as possible, knowing that we're not going to cover every single question that you run into, but you certainly can contact us as you work through this process. And it's really, once you do it one time, I think you'll find it to be not too strenuous, and you'll see how you can do this every year and get much needed resources for your community. And like Tammy said, there is a report that is required, and it's not a very lengthy report, and as you provide services, you'll just want to be able to collect that information so you can summarize that at the end of the year as to how the funding was spent. Tammy, shall we get into some more of the questions then?
I think that we don't have anything. We have a question about a web link that we have to give to her afterwards, and I don't have any other questions at this point.
Okay. Are there any other questions that have not been asked? Again, this is an opportunity for some meaningful services that the funds of which can be used very flexible for the safety of women and children in domestic violence situations, and is something that could be very meaningful to them and to you, as we never seem to have enough resources to help our communities.
So, Michelle, there was a question about clarification, and that question was, are you saying that the application goes via SAM? The announcement says it is to go to OLDC. What is SAM? So a clarification on the difference there.
Yes, I actually can clarify that for you. Okay. SAM.gov is the standard place that you have to apply no matter what grant or what agency you're applying for, and that's something that the tribe needs to keep current. They've made that a little stricter at this point, but it doesn't have anything to do with the actual application, except you have to have it in order to apply. The OLDC system is where you will apply, and I find that system can be a little bit cumbersome, but have learned to navigate it a little bit. And what it does is that OLDC system takes you over into Grant Solution when you sign on, to both submit your grant and also to submit your end of the year report. And so it's a system to become familiar with for the application. Again, if you are having difficulties, you can contact the FVPSA office. So I would encourage anyone that's applying for this that hasn't possibly used the system before to do an experimental, go ahead and get in there and move around and make sure you have the current passwords and all of those things that you need well before the deadline.
Are there any other questions at this point?
There is a question, or at least a request, that it would be good to hear some ideas of how other tribes are utilizing the money.
Tammy, do you want to take that question?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of different, I think tribes are doing many different things. Like I said, I know that some tribes use the Fvpsa funds to supplement a position so that their TFYS can then also be their advocate and work with families that may be experiencing abuse. And because it's a small amount, sometimes that takes up quite a bit of that. Other tribes are supporting their safe homes and through stipends. Sometimes if they have people that are staying in their homes, they may offer them a stipend for the family staying there. Rental kind of assistance, especially in emergency situations where you might have access to a hotel in a larger community that you can get someone into if they can't get into shelter. The airfare, as you know, of course, all of us, our airfare and travel costs are exorbitant. And so it's been very helpful for that in terms of traveling victims. Housing shelter services. I know that several of the grantees are actually funding positions and funding shelters themselves, like in Amonic, and I think Manilik uses some of theirs for that. You can also do some training for both some of your advocates, somebody, even if it's a TFYS that's being partially funded, but trying to train them in advocacy training, doing some prevention work. We're finding that a lot of tribes are using this to bring in a presenter for a day or two, whether that's with the school or the community. And it doesn't have to be a real formal presentation. I know some tribes have even brought, say, a presenter to their annual meeting and paid the cost for them to come, and maybe a stipend for them to be there to talk about the domestic violence and the effects of domestic violence on, victims, but also families. So I think there's just a large, I know that focusing on youth and children, doing some prevention activities with youth and children, doing craft nights that help, implement these discussions. Sometimes people won't show up to a formal training about DV because, nobody wants to be seen going into that building. But you might be able to supply some sewing material and have a sewing night and have real informal discussions. They don't have to be super formal. You may want to, offer a stipend to an elder to help be an elder counselor. So there's a lot of different ways the money can be utilized. Does that answer the question?
I think also, Tammy, that's a great explanation. But also, if you look through the application process, the template that we've provided, there's a lot of ideas as well as to what you would be providing, either generally or specifically. So, I guess the short answer is, just stay focused on the services for the women and children to get them out of a dangerous situation, and you'll find solutions to make that work for your community. Are there any other questions?
I think there's one that we can follow up on after, but we are out of time.
Well, this is Michelle, and I just want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your busy lives to attend this webinar, and we hope that you received information that will be helpful to your community. And I'll turn it over to Candy for a final comment.
And Candy, could you please put it on the information page that has our contact information for folks? And we, again, Excuse me. Thank you everyone for listening, and please reach out to us if we can answer questions or just help support you in applying, or just, if you just have a general question, go ahead and reach out. And this is the contact number for the main office, and both Michelle and my email, our website, and our fax number. And so, again, we really welcome people to call and ask questions, and we will attempt to answer them to the best of our ability.
And as we've mentioned already, we will be posting this webinar recording on our website later tomorrow. So look for that too. That's aknwrc.org.
And thank you so much.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.